In the shadowed corridors of the Palazzo della Signoria, where Florence's fate was decided by whispered conversations and carefully orchestrated glances, Niccolò Machiavelli understood a truth that would outlive empires: the most profound power operates in silence. It was the autumn of 1502, and the young diplomat found himself observing Cesare Borgia, the Duke Valentino, whose reputation for ruthless efficiency preceded him like a storm cloud. Yet what struck Machiavelli was not the Duke's dramatic displays of force, but rather the quiet calculations that preceded every decisive action. The Duke sat motionless in his private study, surrounded by maps of the Romagna and dispatches from his captains. No raised voices, no theatrical gestures, just the steady scratch of quill on parchment as he penned instructions that would reshape the political landscape of central Italy. In that moment, Machiavelli witnessed the birth of what he would later call the energia silenziosa, the silent energy that shapes the world not through spectacle, but through the patient accumulation of small, seemingly insignificant acts that compound into unstoppable force. This energy, Machiavelli realized, was the true currency of lasting influence. While lesser men exhausted themselves in grand proclamations and public demonstrations of their authority, the truly powerful understood that their greatest weapon was the ability to remain undetected while orchestrating the very fabric of events around them. It was not the roar of the lion that commanded respect, but the silent stalking that preceded the strike. Years later, as Machiavelli penned his observations from exile in Sant'Andrea in Percasina, he reflected on this principle that had governed every successful ruler he had encountered. From the Medici banking empire that had quietly financed half of Europe to the Vatican's invisible network of influence that extended into every royal court, the pattern remained consistent: those who spoke the loudest wielded the least enduring power, while those who moved in silence shaped the destiny of nations. The law he formulated was deceptively simple yet profoundly complex in its applications: true influence operates through what cannot be seen, heard, or directly confronted. It flows like water, finding the smallest cracks in an opponent's defenses and gradually expanding them until the entire structure crumbles. This was not merely a political strategy, but a fundamental principle of human nature that governed relationships at every level of society, from the merchant's guildhall to the papal chambers. The first manifestation of this law revealed itself in what Machiavelli termed the architecture of silence. He had observed how Cosimo de' Medici, decades before his own time, had built an empire not through conquest but through the careful placement of debts and obligations. Every favor granted, every loan extended, every quiet word of support offered in a moment of crisis, these created invisible chains of loyalty that proved far stronger than any treaty written in ink. The Medici never demanded immediate recognition or public acknowledgement of their power. Instead, they allowed others to believe they acted of their own free will, while every significant decision in Florence somehow aligned with Medici interests. This architecture operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At its foundation lay the cultivation of information networks, not the crude spy systems employed by tyrants, but subtle webs of trust and mutual benefit that encouraged voluntary disclosure. Merchants shared market intelligence over wine, scholars discussed philosophical matters that revealed political leanings, and clergy offered spiritual counsel that illuminated the fears and ambitions of the powerful. None of these conversations appeared significant in isolation, yet together they formed a comprehensive picture of the political landscape that allowed for precise, targeted action. The middle tier of this architecture consisted of what Machiavelli called beneficial interventions, acts that appeared to serve others' interests while advancing one's own agenda. When Lorenzo de' Medici arranged marriages between rival families, he presented it as peacemaking while actually creating new centers of influence loyal to his house. When he funded public works projects, he gained credit for civic improvement while ensuring that key artisans and workers became dependent on Medici patronage. Each intervention seemed generous and selfless, yet together they wove an inescapable web of obligation and dependence. The highest level of this architecture involved the manipulation of perception itself. The truly powerful understood that reality mattered less than how reality was interpreted and communicated. By controlling the narratives that shaped public understanding, they could make their enemies appear unreasonable while positioning themselves as the voices of moderation and wisdom. This required not the suppression of opposing viewpoints, but their subtle redirection toward predetermined conclusions. Opposition was allowed, even encouraged, but within carefully constructed boundaries that ensured all debates ultimately served the interests of those who had shaped the terms of discussion. The second principle of Machiavelli's law concerned the paradox of visible invisibility. The most effective practitioners of quiet influence maintained public personas that were simultaneously prominent and unremarkable. They occupied positions that granted access to important decision-makers without attracting scrutiny or suspicion. They were known without being understood, recognized without being analyzed. This required a delicate balance between engagement and detachment, between action and restraint. Machiavelli had witnessed this principle in operation during his diplomatic missions to France and Germany. The courtiers who truly shaped royal policy were rarely the ones who stood closest to the throne during public ceremonies. Instead, they were the figures who appeared in the background of every important painting, who sat quietly in the corners of every crucial meeting, who offered seemingly casual observations that planted seeds of doubt or confidence in the monarch's mind. They cultivated reputations for reliability and discretion rather than brilliance or ambition, understanding that those who appeared too clever or too eager inevitably attracted opposition. These masters of visible invisibility developed what Machiavelli called the language of indirection, a sophisticated form of communication that conveyed precise meaning while maintaining plausible deniability. They never directly contradicted their superiors, but posed thoughtful questions that led to desired conclusions. They never openly criticized rivals, but shared carefully selected information that allowed others to reach damning judgments. They never claimed credit for their successes, but ensured that their contributions were remembered by those who mattered when important decisions needed to be made. The cultivation of this invisible prominence required years of patient effort and absolute consistency. A single moment of revealed ambition, one instance of claiming undeserved credit, or any display of contempt for those they secretly influenced could shatter the entire edifice. The practitioner had to genuinely embody the persona they projected, becoming so thoroughly committed to the role that the distinction between performance and reality dissolved. This was perhaps the greatest sacrifice required by the law of quiet influence, the surrender of public recognition in exchange for actual power. The third and most complex aspect of Machiavelli's law involved the strategic use of time itself as a weapon. While others exhausted themselves in immediate battles for temporary advantages, masters of quiet influence operated on extended timescales that allowed for the gradual accumulation of decisive advantages. They understood that the human mind naturally focused on immediate threats and opportunities while overlooking slow-moving patterns that ultimately proved more significant. This temporal blindness created opportunities for those patient enough to exploit it. Machiavelli had observed this principle during the rise of Pope Alexander VI, Cesare Borgia's father. The Borgia family's ascension to papal power had not been the result of any single brilliant maneuver, but rather the cumulative effect of decades of careful positioning within the church hierarchy. Each generation had advanced slightly higher, each marriage had created new alliances, each act of service to existing powers had created obligations that could later be collected. By the time rivals recognized the threat posed by Borgia ambition, the family had become too deeply entrenched to dislodge through conventional means. This temporal strategy required practitioners to think in terms of decades rather than years, to plant seeds whose fruits they might never personally harvest, and to maintain consistency across changing circumstances that would test their resolve and adaptability. They had to resist the constant temptation to accelerate their progress through more dramatic means, understanding that patience was not merely a virtue but the essential ingredient that made all their other efforts possible. The manipulation of time also involved the careful control of rhythm and momentum in all interactions. Masters of quiet influence learned to recognize when to advance and when to retreat, when to apply pressure and when to provide relief, when to reveal knowledge and when to remain silent. They developed an intuitive understanding of psychological timing that allowed them to introduce ideas when minds were most receptive, to offer solutions precisely when problems became intolerable, and to withdraw support at moments when its absence would be most deeply felt. This temporal mastery extended to the realm of information warfare. Rather than attacking opponents directly, practitioners of quiet influence would plant seeds of doubt that would gradually grow into larger concerns. A casual mention of financial irregularities would eventually blossom into full-scale audits. A thoughtful question about loyalty would evolve into comprehensive background investigations. A gentle expression of concern about competence would ultimately result in reassignments to less influential positions. The victims of these campaigns often never identified their true antagonist, attributing their downfall to bad luck or the natural course of events. As Machiavelli reflected on these principles from his exile, he recognized that the law of quiet influence represented more than merely another tool of political manipulation. It revealed a fundamental truth about the nature of power itself, that lasting influence could not be seized through force or maintained through fear, but only cultivated through the patient accumulation of trust, dependence, and obligation. It required practitioners to subordinate their egos to their ambitions, to find satisfaction in results rather than recognition, and to measure success not in terms of immediate gratification but in terms of enduring impact. The Duke Valentino, for all his tactical brilliance, had ultimately failed because he had relied too heavily on dramatic displays of power that created enemies faster than allies. His reign had been a spectacular flame that burned brightly and briefly before being extinguished by the very forces he had sought to intimidate. In contrast, families like the Medici endured for centuries because they had mastered the art of making themselves indispensable rather than merely formidable. The law of quiet influence demanded a complete reimagining of what it meant to be powerful. Traditional concepts of leadership emphasized command and control, the ability to compel obedience through superior force or authority. But Machiavelli had observed that such power was inherently fragile, dependent on maintaining advantages that could be lost through a single defeat or miscalculation. True influence, by contrast, operated through the willing cooperation of others who believed their own interests were being served. It created networks of mutual dependence that became stronger over time rather than weaker. In the merchant republics of northern Italy, Machiavelli had witnessed the emergence of a new class of power brokers who embodied these principles with remarkable sophistication. They were neither princes nor priests, neither warriors nor scholars, but something entirely new, professional influencers who made their living by facilitating the ambitions of others while quietly advancing their own agendas. They possessed no armies, controlled no territories, and held no formal offices, yet their opinions shaped trade policies, their recommendations determined military alliances, and their approval or disapproval could make or break political careers. These new power brokers operated through what Machiavelli termed networks of necessity, interconnected webs of relationships that made their continued involvement essential to the functioning of the broader system. They positioned themselves as bridges between competing factions, as translators between different languages of power, as repositories of institutional memory that could not be easily replaced. They made themselves valuable not through what they could do independently, but through what they enabled others to accomplish. The cultivation of such networks required extraordinary diplomatic skills and psychological insight. Practitioners had to understand the deepest motivations of every significant player in their environment, identifying the fears, ambitions, and blind spots that could be leveraged to create mutual dependencies. They had to maintain multiple relationships simultaneously without allowing any single alliance to compromise their ability to work with others. Most challenging of all, they had to project an image of neutrality and disinterestedness while actively advancing carefully concealed agendas. This balancing act demanded what Machiavelli called the discipline of masks, the ability to present different faces to different audiences without ever revealing one's true intentions or ultimate loyalties. The most successful practitioners developed genuine expertise in multiple domains, allowing them to speak authentically with soldiers about military matters, with merchants about trade, with scholars about philosophy, and with clergy about theology. This versatility made them valuable advisors while obscuring the systematic nature of their influence operations. The masks were not merely superficial performances but represented deep commitments to understanding and serving the legitimate interests of various constituencies. This created a paradoxical situation in which the pursuit of personal power required genuine dedication to the welfare of others. The most effective operators of quiet influence became genuinely useful to those they sought to control, creating relationships that benefited all parties even as they served hidden purposes. As the Renaissance matured and political systems became more complex, Machiavelli observed the evolution of increasingly sophisticated applications of quiet influence. The banking houses of Florence and Venice developed techniques for shaping economic policy that would make modern central bankers envious. By carefully controlling the flow of credit and information, they could encourage or discourage various types of economic activity without ever issuing direct commands or making explicit threats. Their influence operated through the invisible hand of market forces that they had learned to guide with remarkable precision. Religious orders mastered similar techniques in the spiritual realm, shaping popular opinion and elite behavior through carefully orchestrated campaigns of moral persuasion. Rather than relying on formal authority or explicit doctrine, they cultivated networks of informal influence that reached into every level of society. Monks and friars who appeared to have renounced worldly power actually wielded forms of influence that secular rulers could only envy, precisely because their power was perceived as spiritual rather than political. The artistic community developed perhaps the most subtle forms of quiet influence, using beauty and culture to shape the deeper currents of social consciousness. Painters, sculptors, poets, and musicians learned to embed political messages within aesthetic experiences, influencing popular attitudes and elite sensibilities in ways that bypassed rational analysis. The greatest artists of the period were not merely creating beautiful objects but actively participating in the construction of new forms of social reality. These various streams of influence, economic, religious, and cultural, often operated independently but sometimes converged to create moments of extraordinary historical change. When the interests of bankers, clergy, and artists aligned around particular political objectives, the resulting transformations appeared to emerge spontaneously from the natural evolution of society rather than from any coordinated campaign. This organic quality made such changes particularly difficult to resist or reverse, since they seemed to represent the will of providence rather than human manipulation. Machiavelli recognized that the law of quiet influence was not merely a tool for ambitious individuals but a fundamental mechanism of social evolution. Societies that developed sophisticated networks of indirect influence proved more adaptable and resilient than those that relied primarily on formal authority and coercive power. They could respond to changing circumstances more quickly, incorporate new ideas more readily, and maintain stability through periods of external pressure that might destroy more rigid systems. This insight had profound implications for his understanding of statecraft and governance. The most successful states were not those with the strongest armies or the most efficient bureaucracies, but those that had mastered the art of governing through influence rather than force. They created conditions in which citizens willingly cooperated with state objectives because those objectives had been aligned with private interests through careful manipulation of incentives and opportunities. Such states required a new kind of leadership, rulers who understood that their primary function was not to command obedience but to orchestrate consent. These leaders had to be simultaneously visible and invisible, serving as public symbols of authority while operating through private networks of influence that remained largely hidden from public view. They had to project strength and confidence while maintaining the flexibility and adaptability that came from working through others rather than relying solely on their own capabilities. The training required for such leadership differed dramatically from the traditional education of princes and nobles. Instead of focusing primarily on military arts and formal protocol, future practitioners of quiet influence needed deep grounding in psychology, economics, theology, and the arts. They had to develop skills in negotiation, persuasion, and coalition building that went far beyond the simple ability to issue commands and expect obedience. Most importantly, they had to cultivate the patience and emotional discipline required to pursue long-term objectives through indirect means. As Machiavelli contemplated the implications of his observations, he recognized that the law of quiet influence represented both an opportunity and a danger for the future of human society. In the hands of virtuous leaders, these techniques could create unprecedented levels of prosperity, stability, and human flourishing. Complex societies required sophisticated coordination mechanisms, and influence networks offered the possibility of achieving such coordination while preserving individual freedom and initiative. However, the same techniques that could serve noble purposes could also be employed for exploitation and manipulation. Leaders who mastered quiet influence while lacking moral constraints could create systems of control that were far more comprehensive and durable than any traditional tyranny. By making oppression invisible and voluntary, they could achieve levels of dominance that would have been impossible through purely coercive means. The key difference lay not in the techniques themselves but in the ultimate objectives they served. Those who employed quiet influence in service of genuine public good created positive-sum situations in which their own power grew alongside the welfare of those they influenced. Their networks of control became networks of mutual benefit that strengthened over time through shared success and prosperity. In contrast, those who used the same techniques for purely selfish purposes eventually undermined the very foundations of their own power by creating negative-sum dynamics that bred resentment and resistance. This distinction pointed toward what Machiavelli considered the highest application of his law, the creation of influence networks explicitly designed to serve the long-term interests of entire communities rather than narrow elite factions. Such networks would require leaders capable of thinking beyond their own lifespans and personal ambitions, individuals committed to building institutions that would continue to serve beneficial purposes long after their creators had passed from the scene. The development of such leadership represented perhaps the greatest challenge facing the emerging modern world. Traditional systems of hereditary authority and religious legitimacy were proving inadequate to the complexities of increasingly sophisticated societies. New forms of governance were needed that could harness the benefits of quiet influence while preventing its abuse. This would require not only wise leaders but also educated populations capable of recognizing and resisting manipulation while supporting genuine service to the common good. As the sun set over the Tuscan hills surrounding his modest farm, Machiavelli reflected on the irony that his own influence would ultimately depend on the very principles he had observed in others. His writings would not shape the world through dramatic revelation or compelling authority, but through the gradual accumulation of readers who would internalize his insights and apply them in countless small ways across multiple generations. The true test of his ideas would not be their immediate impact but their ability to survive, adapt, and evolve through changing circumstances while continuing to provide useful guidance for those who sought to understand and shape human affairs. The law of quiet influence thus revealed itself as both a description of existing reality and a prescription for future action. It explained how the world actually worked beneath the surface of apparent events while providing a framework for more effective and ethical engagement with the complex dynamics of human society. Those who mastered its principles would find themselves better equipped to pursue their objectives while contributing to the broader project of human civilization. Those who ignored its implications would find themselves increasingly marginalized by forces they could neither understand nor control. In the final analysis, Machiavelli's law of quiet influence represented recognition that true power in complex societies could not be seized or held through traditional means but only earned through the patient cultivation of trust, competence, and mutual benefit. It required practitioners to surrender immediate gratification in favor of enduring impact, personal recognition in favor of actual results, and the illusion of control in favor of the reality of influence. These were demanding sacrifices, but they offered the possibility of achieving forms of power and satisfaction that remained forever beyond the reach of those who relied on cruder and more visible methods of domination. The relentless energy that could not be tamed was not the explosive force of revolution or conquest, but the quiet persistence of influence that shaped the world one relationship, one conversation, one small decision at a time. It required no armies to implement, no treasures to sustain, and no institutions to legitimate. It existed wherever thoughtful individuals chose to work through others rather than against them, wherever patient accumulation replaced dramatic gesture, wherever the pursuit of enduring value took precedence over immediate advantage. In recognizing and articulating this principle, Machiavelli had identified not merely another political strategy but a fundamental law of human nature that would continue to operate as long as people lived and worked together in organized societies. The true practitioners of this law would never be remembered as conquerors or revolutionaries, but their influence would prove far more enduring than any empire or ideology. They would shape the world not through what they destroyed but through what they built, not through whom they defeated but through whom they empowered, not through the fear they inspired but through the trust they earned. In the end, this quiet influence would prove to be the most relentless energy of all, precisely because it could never be directly confronted, completely understood, or permanently suppressed. It would continue to flow like water, finding new paths around every obstacle, gradually transforming the landscape of human possibility in ways that would only become fully apparent across the vast expanses of historical time.